So anyway, how did this happen? How did we go from 97,000 inmates in the California Youth Authority down to, again, the 1,600 we've got today, and still falling? Number of issues, but I want to kind of tick off, and like most things in life, you know, these things are overdetermined. There's probably too many reasons that explain this drop. Certainly it was not demographics, because the California population has continued to increase during this period of time. It is certainly true that unlike the adult system, the juvenile system is much more responsive to declines in arrests, because length of stay is so much shorter. So whereas you could have declining arrests and increasing prison populations, in the juvenile system that's not going to happen, because people are going to spend less time and they're going to get out as few people enter the system. So that had some effect on what went on. Beginning in the late 90s, there was a big focus on parole and length of stay. And we have, I think, one of the few, if only, systems where we have an independent parole board that determines release from our juvenile prisons. And the first thing that happened in California was a movement on the part of a number of us, advocates, people in the legal community, that were trying to get rid of this parole board. You know, politically appointed group that was acting kind of at odds, even against the recommendations of corrections staff, and they seemed out of control. You know, kids would do everything their corrections people would tell them to do, and then they go to the parole board, and the parole board would not like their attitude, so add more time. And in fact, for years, what we demonstrated was, for the most serious crimes, you'd actually do more time in the juvenile system than you would in the adult system. Because in the adult system, you could get time off for good behavior. In the juvenile system, you couldn't get that. And they kept on adding time based on your, quote, inability to demonstrate your progress in treatment. I mean, it was a very bizarre thing. I could go into that at length, but I won't. But anyway, so a lot of us were saying, easy solution. Get rid of the parole board. Just let the Department of Youth Corrections figure out when kids are ready for release. There are presumptive terms. So what do we need this group for? Couldn't make a lot of progress on that, but one state senator, John Burton, who was very powerful, went up to the parole board and said, I'll tell you what, if you won't start bringing down the lengths of stay, I'm going to bring down your salaries. So he zeroed out the budget of the parole board and said, within a month, come back with a plan to reduce length of stay, or you're not going to exist anymore. And guess what? They came up with a plan. And so initially the population dropped from about 9,800 down to about 8,500 in a relatively short period of time, because suddenly the parole board started paroling people. And they stopped revoking parole. You know, essentially based on fear that a very powerful state senator was going to just get rid of them. So that started the track downward. What happened next in the late 90s was an interesting program in California, which first was called the Challenge Grant, and then it became the Crime Prevention Act. It essentially was premised on probation coming forward and saying, if you really give us some money, we're going to demonstrate programs that will keep kids out of these institutions and get better results. So the state actually put up a substantial amount of money, initially on a competitive basis, but then ultimately on a formula basis to all the counties, for the purposes of setting up alternative programs for juvenile offenders. And this program went on, still goes on today. There's about 120 million gets distributed to the counties, and even though it's no longer based on a sort of competitive RFP process, which was the first stage of it, there's still a lot of accountability, a lot of monitoring, quarterly reporting on who's in your programs, what are you doing, et cetera. And I would say that on average, this program did produce another significant reduction in the population of the Youth Authority, because counties had the resources for the first time to develop pretty intensive programs, either in their local camps or in intensive probation, to divert youth from the system. So the numbers continued going down. Again, there's not sort of 1 year where the numbers drop precipitously, but it's like a straight line going downward. The next most significant event, in my opinion, was when the Prison Law Office, which is one of the foremost litigating operations in the country, began challenging the conditions of confinement in the California Youth Authority. Suit began, or at least the beginnings of it began in 2000. In 2003, the Attorney General asked me and a whole flock of people to conduct an investigation on behalf of the Attorney General to determine if these allegations of massive abuses of kids were true. Parenthetically, it was an interesting legal strategy because for years no one felt they could touch the Youth Authority because of the amount of money it would take, the discovery it would take to prove the case. Well, what in effect happened here was the Attorney General of the state of California, Bill Lockyer, paid for the discovery, because the minute our reports were done, it was in the public domain, it was out there, and everybody could use it. So a number of us, and again, this ran the gamut. I was responsible for sort of traditional corrections issues, which came to be known as safety and welfare. Eric Troupin led in the mental health area. We had special ed people, we had medical people, dental people. I mean, it was every conceivable part of it was part of this team. And at the end of 2003, we issued a whole series of reports. And essentially what we found was a deplorable system that was violating federal laws, state laws, common decency at every level. In fact, not a single expert could find a single area in which they were complying with basic requirements. So for example, the kids were not getting the education required under education law. There were no special ed programs going on. Kids with disabilities were getting no services. Medical care was terrible. One example we came across where, typically they'd hire these often unlicensed or extremely overaged doctors who were the medical people. We found kids with sickle cell anemia being treated with Tylenol. In the pharmacy, there was no pharmaceutical control. You couldn't determine who was getting what medications, any day, any type, on and on and on. In my area, I found kids in cages, literally cages. They were like the size of a phone booth, and that would be their school. You know, that if you were determined to be dangerous, you would have to spend your school day sitting in a cage while a teacher would be passing either a computer keyboard or books to you through the cage. And that would be your school. We found huge amounts of isolation and segregation, 24 hours a day, maybe sometimes 23, but it was hard to tell, for months on end. Extraordinary levels of violence, levels that, I was able to document a minimum of 4,000 serious assaults of youth on youth during this period of time. I think during this period of time, we were talking about maybe as many as 10 suicides. Again, this was an awful system. And the net effect of this investigation was to make public what had been a pretty quiet, kept under wraps situation. And probably the single most important thing that happened as this litigation rolled out, and by the way, it was not easy. I still have the federal court judge who said that these conditions do not rise to federal intervention. And you wonder, you know, what Constitution was he reading?